Okay, so you want to own a zoo. You picture the gates opening, kids running toward the giraffe enclosure, a line of families buying tickets before you've even had your coffee. You imagine yourself walking around in khaki shorts, greeting visitors, maybe holding a parrot on your shoulder for photos, some kind of real-life wildlife mogul with your own private kingdom of animals. That's the dream. Here's what actually happens. First, how do you even get into this business? You've got basically three paths. You buy an existing zoo that's already struggling and needs new capital. You inherit or take over a small roadside zoo from a family that's run out of energy or money. Or the hardest path, you build one from scratch on raw land, starting with nothing but dirt and a dream. Let's talk numbers because they get ugly fast. A small regional zoo, nothing fancy, maybe 40 species, and a few hundred animals will run you somewhere between $5 million and $20 million just to get the land, permits, and basic enclosures built. If you want something like a mid-sized zoo, the kind that could actually pull in 500,000 visitors a year, you're looking at $50 million to $100 million before you sell a single ticket. And if you're dreaming of something like a San Diego Zoo or a Bronx Zoo tier operation, forget it. Those took decades and hundreds of millions of dollars in accumulated investment, much of it from donors and city funding, not paying customers walking through the gate. So let's say you go the realistic route. You buy a mid-sized zoo that's already operating, maybe one that's been in a family for 2 generations, and they're tired of the grind. You're going to pay somewhere between $10 million and $30 million depending on land value, animal inventory, and whether the enclosures meet modern accreditation standards. Sounds like a real business you could run, right? It is. But here's the problem, and it's a problem almost nobody thinks about before they sign the papers. The actual cost of owning animals is where most new zoo owners get blindsided. You don't really buy animals the way you'd buy inventory for a store. Most zoos today don't buy and sell big animals for cash at all. Instead, there's something called a species survival plan, run by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums in the US, and similar bodies in Europe and Australia, where animals are essentially on loan between accredited zoos for breeding and conservation purposes. So your elephant, your tiger, your gorilla, you don't own them outright in the traditional sense you'd expect. You're managing them as part of a shared genetic pool. And the accrediting body has a say in where that animal goes, who it breeds with, and sometimes even whether you're allowed to keep it if your facility doesn't meet welfare standards. This means your star attraction, the animal everyone's coming to see, isn't fully yours to control. That's the first hidden trap. You think you own the headline act. You don't, not entirely, and that lack of control can upend your whole business plan overnight if a partner zoo decides to reclaim a breeding pair, or if a species coordinator decides your facility isn't the right fit anymore. The second hidden trap is that expenses start long before revenue does, sometimes years before. If you're building enclosures for elephants, expect 18 months to 3 years of construction, permitting, and USDA or equivalent inspection before a single elephant sets foot inside. During that time, you're paying interest on construction loans, you're paying architects who specialize in naturalistic habitat design, which is a tiny, expensive niche with maybe a handful of firms in the world who really know what they're doing, and you're paying insurance and security on a facility that generates zero revenue. A single well-designed elephant habitat done properly with pools, shade structures, and enough acreage to meet modern welfare guidelines can cost $8 million to $12 million alone. That's before you've fed a single animal or sold a single ticket. Multiply that kind of capital outlay across a dozen major exhibits, elephants, big cats, primates, an aquarium wing, a reptile house, and you start to understand why so many zoo projects stall out halfway through construction, sitting there half-built while the owners scramble for a second round of financing, watching interest payments pile up on buildings that don't have a single visitor walking through them yet. And feeding animals is not cheap either, not even close. A single adult elephant eats somewhere between 150 and 300 pounds of food a day, mostly hay, produce, and specialized supplements formulated by nutritionists who work exclusively with exotic animals. A tiger needs about 10 to 15 pounds of meat daily, and that meat has to be high quality and properly sourced because a sick tiger with an infected gut costs you far more in vet bills than the food would have cost in the first place. Across a zoo with 200 to 500 animals, feeding costs alone can run $1 to $3 million a year, and that number climbs fast if your collection leans toward big carnivores rather than smaller herbivores, since meat is dramatically more expensive per pound than hay and produce. Then there's veterinary care, and this is where things get genuinely brutal, because exotic animal medicine is one of the most specialized and expensive fields in all of veterinary science. An MRI machine big enough to scan a lion doesn't exist in most facilities, so if your lion needs advanced diagnostics, you might be trucking it, sedated, to a university veterinary hospital hours away. paying tens of thousands of dollars for a single procedure, plus the transport costs and the risk of anesthetizing a 500-pound predator, which is its own specialized skill. Dental work on a hippo, surgery on a giraffe's leg, a C-section on a gorilla. These aren't routine procedures with a fixed price list. They're custom operations requiring specialists flown in from other institutions, sometimes from another continent entirely. Zoos budget 7 figures a year just for veterinary staff, medication, quarantine facilities, and emergency procedures for a mid-sized collection. And that's assuming nothing catastrophic happens. A disease outbreak like an avian flu scare running through a bird collection can force an entire wing to close for weeks while you test, quarantine, and disinfect, burning cash with zero revenue coming in from that section. All while still paying full staff salaries and full feed bills for animals nobody's allowed to look at. On top of feeding and veterinary care, you've got staffing costs that people wildly underestimate. A mid-sized zoo needs specialized keepers for each animal group, and good keepers who know large carnivore behavior or great ape social dynamics are not easy to find and not cheap to retain. Because they're trained professionals with years of specialized experience, not just people who like animals. Add in security staff, because escaped animal protocols are a serious liability concern, maintenance crews who understand the unique demands of animal enclosures, education staff who run school programs and administrative overhead, and payroll alone can eat up 40 to 50% of total revenue at a well-run zoo. That's before insurance, which for a facility housing dangerous animals is its own specialized and expensive category, covering everything from visitor injury to animal escape to natural disaster damage to climate-controlled habitats. So how does a zoo actually make money? Because so far this sounds like a money pit with cute mascots attached. There are 2 main revenue engines, and one is a lot more obvious than the other. The first, the obvious one, is ticket sales and on-site spending. Adult admission at a well-known zoo runs anywhere from $20 to $40, and then you've got parking, food, gift shop, merchandise, and the classic encounter experiences like paying $80 to feed a giraffe or hand-feed a lorikeet, or $200 for a behind-the-scenes tour with a keeper where you get to help prepare a tiger's dinner. On average, a visitor who pays for general admission ends up spending another $15 to $25 on top of their ticket once you count food and souvenirs. This is regulated in the sense that ticket pricing is visible, competitive, and pretty capped. Because if you charge too much, families just won't come. They'll go to the aquarium across town instead, or just stay home and watch nature documentaries for free. A zoo without steady foot traffic dies fast because your fixed costs, the animal care, the staff, the insurance, don't go down just because attendance drops on a rainy weekend. This income stream is real, but it's also seasonal, weather-dependent, and limited by how many people physically fit through your gates in a given day, which caps your upside no matter how popular you get. The second revenue stream, the less obvious one, is where the real margin actually lives, and it's membership and donor programs combined with breeding and conservation partnerships. Annual memberships, where a family pays $150 to $300 a year for unlimited visits, are incredibly profitable because they lock in revenue up front regardless of how many times the family actually shows up, and they create an emotional bond that turns into donations later down the line. Beyond that, accredited zoos receive government grants, corporate sponsorships tied to conservation programs, and sometimes direct payments or cost-sharing arrangements from other zoos when they loan out a valuable breeding animal. A rare species birth, say a successful panda cub or a critically endangered rhino calf, can generate a wave of media coverage worth millions of dollars in free advertising, membership spikes, and donor enthusiasm that a marketing budget could never buy on its own. This is the less regulated, higher margin side of the business, because donations and sponsorship deals aren't capped by what a family can afford for a day out. They're capped only by how compelling your conservation story is and how good your development team is at telling it to wealthy donors and foundations. There's actually a third, quieter revenue stream too, and it's licensing and media. A zoo with a genuinely charismatic animal or a compelling conservation story can license its footage to documentary producers, partner with streaming platforms for behind-the-scenes content, or even land corporate sponsorship deals where a company pays to have its name attached to a specific exhibit. The way stadiums sell naming rights. These deals aren't huge for most zoos, but for the ones with a breakout star animal, a famous panda, or a beloved gorilla with its own social media following, this can add hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars a year with almost no marginal cost, since the animal is already there and already being filmed by visitors constantly anyway. Now let's talk about what happens when this goes wrong, because it goes wrong constantly, and the industry is littered with cautionary tales. Look at the dozens of small roadside zoos across North America that operated for years on razor-thin margins. One bad summer of low attendance away from collapse. unable to afford the veterinary care their aging animal collections needed. But the most instructive failure, the one everyone actually knows, is the story that became the basis of the Netflix sensation about a private zoo owner in Oklahoma. That zoo, at its peak, housed over 200 big cats, and it survived for years not on ticket revenue, which was modest given its rural location, but on cub petting experiences and questionable breeding practices that generated cash from tourists paying to hold baby tigers for photos. A practice that required constant breeding to keep a steady supply of young cubs small enough to handle. When public and legal pressure eventually shut down that revenue model, cutting off unregulated cub encounters through new legislation like the Big Cat Public Safety Act, the entire financial structure collapsed within a couple of years, ending in bankruptcy, animal seizures by federal authorities, and a facility sold off for a fraction of what had been invested in it. The lesson is that if your entire business model depends on one legally gray revenue stream, one regulatory change wipes you out completely, no matter how many visitors you were pulling in the year before. There's also the case of Marineland in Ontario, Canada, which for years faced mounting criticism and legal scrutiny over its marine mammal care, leading to a steady decline in attendance and a wave of animal transfers, ultimately shrinking a once major tourist attraction into a shadow of what it used to be, with reported annual losses stretching into the tens of millions of dollars as visitor numbers kept falling year after year. That's a case where reputational risk alone, not even a single catastrophic event, slowly strangled the revenue side of the business while the fixed costs of animal care stayed exactly the same. Since you can't simply lay off your veterinary staff or stop feeding your animals just because attendance is down, and it's not just North America. Smaller municipal zoos across Europe have faced similar death spirals, where aging infrastructure built in the mid-20th century no longer meets modern accreditation standards, but the city or private owner can't raise the capital for renovations, leading to a slow decline in both animal welfare and visitor numbers simultaneously, each one making the other worse until the only options left are a massive capital injection, a takeover by a larger organization, or closure. Now for a success story. And this one's a genuine giant. SeaWorld's parent company in the US shows what happens when a zoo-style operation scales properly, even though it also shows the risk of depending on a few marquee species, since its own stock took a beating after a documentary changed public opinion about orca captivity, forcing the company to phase out its orca breeding program entirely and pivot its marketing and its capital spending toward roller coasters and other attractions instead. But the cleanest example of doing it right is the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, which generates north of $300 million a year combined between its zoo and safari park, with roughly 40% of that coming from memberships, donations, and philanthropic giving, rather than ticket sales alone. That's the model. Build an emotional, mission-driven relationship with visitors so they become donors and members, not just one-time ticket buyers who show up once and never come back. Similarly, the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium in Ohio, for years considered one of the best-run zoos in the country under its earlier leadership, pulled in over $25 million in annual revenue with membership retention above 80% year over year, proving that a strong local brand and community trust can turn a regional zoo into a genuinely profitable operation, at least until governance problems emerged later and shook public confidence, showing that even a financially successful model can be undone quickly by scandal. So what actually separates a zoo that thrives from one that goes bankrupt? Scale matters enormously, because fixed costs like veterinary staff, accreditation, compliance, and enclosure maintenance don't shrink much whether you have 50,000 visitors a year or 500,000, so you need enough foot traffic to spread those costs thin across a large enough customer base. Location matters just as much, because a zoo an hour outside a major metro area with good highway access will always outperform a zoo in a remote rural town, no matter how impressive the animal collection is, simply because of the sheer number of potential visitors within driving distance and the number of school groups that can realistically bus in for a field trip. And dependency risk is huge too. If your zoo relies on one-star attraction, one baby panda, one famous elephant, you're one animal death, illness, or transfer away from a catastrophic drop in visitors and donations. The way several zoos have seen membership renewals crater the year after a beloved elderly animal passed away. The zoos that survive decades are the ones that built a brand around the whole experience and the conservation mission, not around any single animal that could be gone tomorrow, whether from old age, illness, or a decision by a species coordinator to move it somewhere else entirely. Where's this industry heading? The trend right now is toward fewer, larger, more corporatized zoos and away from small, independent operations. Accreditation standards keep getting stricter every few years, which is good for animal welfare, but brutal for small zoo owners who can't afford the capital upgrades required to keep their accreditation current, things like larger minimum enclosure sizes, more complex enrichment requirements, and more rigorous veterinary staffing ratios. At the same time, immersive habitat design, where visitors walk through naturalistic environments rather than staring at cages, is becoming the new baseline expectation from the public. And that cost an absolute fortune to retrofit into older facilities built decades ago with concrete pits and iron bars that simply don't meet modern welfare or aesthetic standards anymore. There's also a growing shift toward conservation-first marketing, where zoos position themselves less as entertainment venues and more as wildlife rescue and research organizations, because that framing unlocks a much bigger pool of donor and grant money than ticket sales ever could on their own, and it insulates the institution somewhat from the ethical criticism that's increasingly aimed at traditional zoos. Smaller roadside zoos that can't make that transition are slowly being squeezed out, either shutting down entirely or being absorbed into larger accredited networks that can spread the cost of compliance across multiple properties and share specialized veterinary and curatorial staff between locations. There's also a slower but real shift toward sanctuary-style models for certain species, particularly elephants and great apes, where public sentiment and scientific opinion have moved toward believing these highly intelligent, socially complex animals need far more space and social structure than a traditional zoo enclosure can provide. Even a good one. Some zoos are responding by phasing out these species entirely rather than trying to keep pace with the capital demands of building genuinely adequate habitats for them, choosing instead to focus their limited capital on species where the economics and the ethics align more comfortably. So here's the honest math if you're actually considering this. The realistic scenario, you buy a mid-sized zoo for $20 million, you spend another $5 to $10 million over the first few years upgrading enclosures to modern standards. And if you run it well, building a strong membership base and diversifying into education programs and conservation grants, you might net $2 to $4 million a year in profit once things stabilize, which is a modest but real return relative to your total investment, roughly comparable to a decent commercial real estate yield, except with a lot more veterinary bills and a lot more emotional attachment to your balance sheet. The optimistic scenario, the one that actually makes headlines and pays off the debt faster, is you land a rare telegenic breeding success, a baby elephant, a giant panda cub, something the entire region falls in love with. And suddenly your membership triples, your donor base explodes, and you're pulling in $20 to $30 million a year, like the biggest zoos in the country, riding the wave of one incredible animal story that no marketing budget could ever manufacture on its own. And that keeps paying dividends in donor goodwill for years after the initial media wave fades. But most people who buy a zoo land somewhere in between those two outcomes, running a business that barely breaks even for years, propped up by donations and grants, always one bad veterinary bill, one escaped animal headline, or one PR crisis away from real financial trouble. You're not buying a zoo. You're buying a non-stop 7-day-a-week responsibility for hundreds of living creatures who don't care about your cash flow, wrapped in a business model that only really works if people fall in love with what you're doing and keep falling in love with it year after year after year, long after the ribbon-cutting ceremony and the local news coverage have faded into memory.